Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with a Scientist. I'm Leah from Headwaters Science Institute. Today we've got another great scientist who's ready to speak in just a minute. But first, I want to give you an update about a really exciting event that we're doing at Headwaters. So we are going to have world traveler, adventurer, and pioneer Robert Swan speak on March 4th at 5:30 p.m. It'll be a live virtual talk. Registration is free, and you're welcome to donate if you'd like. But Robert is a very powerful figure in the climate activism world, and he's training for his next expedition in Antarctica at Royal Gorge up here in the Tahoe area where we are based. So he's going to give a talk about his research into climate science and his work traveling the world, and it'll be a really, really neat event. You have to register for a ticket, and then that watch link will be available for 48 hours in case you can't make it to the live event. So you can get tickets for that at bit.ly/Polar Pioneer, and we would love to see you there. It's going to be a really fun talk. And I also want to thank Tahoe Mountain Sports, our sponsor, for so generously sponsoring the event. Great sports shop in Truckee, California. Check them out for your skiing, snowboarding, and backcountry needs, and so much more. So to move on, today we're going to welcome Angela Pitera. She's a sixth-year PhD candidate at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she studies animal social behavior and spatial cognition in wild birds. So we're going to hear all about that today. And in addition to research, she also loves teaching. She began in 2012 when she was an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota and has since gone on to teach zoology and field ornithology at field sites, and she now teaches mammalogy and animal behavior at UNR. We're going to hear all about her PhD research on birds. So I'm very happy to welcome Angela Pitera.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So excited. And also, Angela has worked with some of our students before in our program. So always excited to welcome one of our own. Before we jump in, Angela, I'm really curious. We all know it's winter right now. And typically you're out in the field researching birds. How does it change in winter when there's snow on the ground?
Well, it's a lot of work. First off, a lot of times we can't even access the roads. So our study sites aren't too far from Truckee, California. And just off of 89, we work at Sagehead Experimental Forest, so out in California. So a lot of times we can't even access the road. We have to park off the highway, and sometimes we have to put chains on the trucks. And we have to load up trailers with ATVs that have special snow treads on them. And a lot of times we have to snowmobile out to get to our sites. So, and not only that, we have to bring full sets of tools with us, lots of bird seed, because we work with wild birds. So lots of bird seed and all sorts of stuff. So not only are we bringing ourselves and all of our field equipment on the snowmobiles, but we have to have trailers attached to the snowmobiles as well. So lots and lots of equipment instead of just driving a truck out to our sites. So lots of extra stuff. And we're snowshoeing and skiing out there too. So it sounds like a vacation for a lot of people. It sounds like a day off of work, but you're pretty beat at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
transit time too. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, if you wanted to know what bird research not in the winter looks like, Angela's here to tell us more about that. So I'll let you go off and away with your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And actually, yeah, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is during the non-breeding season. So it's a lot of winter stuff. Most of the breeding season stuff I'm not going to talk about today, but our birds do breed during the summer months. So yes, I'm Angela Pitera. I'm a PhD candidate in the Pravosudov Lab. And if you're interested in more of the stuff that we do in our lab, I highly recommend you check out my advisor's website, chickadeecognition.com. He takes a lot of awesome photos. And so I'm at the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm a behavioral ecologist, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the current work I'm doing on spatial cognition and social behavior in our mountain chickadee system. But first, I think I should go over a little definition of behavioral ecology. Behavioral ecology aims to understand how behavior evolves in relation to ecological conditions, including both the physical environment and the social environment, which I would argue includes more than just competitors, predators, and parasites, but that's an awfully slick definition, if I do say so myself, but that's because I took it right out of a wonderful textbook, Introduction to Behavioral Ecology. So at the end of the talk, if you're interested in learning more about behavioral ecology, I highly recommend that you check out this textbook. I think that you can get pretty awesome PDF downloads for a relatively good price. But it's usually not so cut and dry. And what we mean by the physical and social environment, think about that as, abiotic and biotic contexts. And so this is just kind of behavioral ecology I like to think of as the study of animal behavior, but kind of the evolution of animal behavior in an ecological setting. So kind of, we work in kind of how do different conditions, usually at an elevational gradient. So we work in the mountains, so we focus on how the differences between harsher and mild conditions might influence differences in low and high elevation birds. That's kind of a good example of what we do in our system, but that's kind of what we mean by physical environment things. And then social environment, kind of get into a little bit later, but I think those are some good examples. So yeah, I mentioned that I'm going to talk about social behavior, and so while I move into a little bit more specific things on that, I just want you to keep in mind the aims of behavioral ecology that are on this slide. So while we kind of continue on our journey here. So in studying animal behavior and behavioral ecology, we like to talk about costs and benefits like all the time. It's really easy to get kind of too honed in, and a lot of times I like to take a step back and think, okay, what are the costs and benefits, the relative costs and benefits, and the potential costs and benefits to a given context that an animal might find itself in, or to doing a certain act or something like that. So you can think about these like making a pros and cons list, not saying that any animal would sit down and think these things out thoroughly, but that's what we like to think of when studying these types of things. And so when considering animal sociality or group living, there's a lot of different common examples of different costs and benefits or potential costs and benefits that could be functioning at the same time. And so these may depend on both the physical and social environment, or one or the other, like we mentioned on the previous slide. So some of you may be familiar with this. Let me see if my mouse is here. Here we go. So these male elephant seals, you might be familiar with these. They're doing an aggressive display here, probably fighting. They're probably a lot more banged up than you can see from this photo, but they're likely competing for access to female mates, and so that's a cost. We'd consider that a cost of group living. We've got two examples of foraging or finding food. Here as a group, you might be better at finding resources because you can communicate to one another and have different individuals finding resources. And then also, a pack of wolves might be better at taking down and isolating an individual bison that a lone wolf might not be able to do on its own. Then again, it wouldn't need such a large meal on its own. A cost, a good example of a cost, this is very biased, I think, towards some of the benefits, but a good example of potential costs that we're, I think, all very familiar with right now, thinking about how we're all social distancing, is, group living. If you're around more individuals, oh, I lost my mouse, here we are. If you're around more individuals, you might face high risks of disease transmission. So we've got this finch here, and its eyes are kind of closed up. So a lot of times we see this pretty commonly with finches. They're usually pretty gregarious, and so they face higher risks of disease transmission. And so when you're thinking about group living, that's usually a cost associated with that. We've got prairie dogs that are usually pretty good about being vigilant, but at the same time, looking out for predators. If you're making lots of racket, you might be attracting predators as well. So there's kind of the nice balance of when to keep quiet and when to be alerting your fellow fellow group members. And then we have a shoal of fish. And if you're a single fish in this big shoal, you might have a lower risk of getting eaten by a predator because you're in a larger group than if you were off by yourself. So a lot of my work looks at how factors of the physical environment might influence social behavior. I'm not going to focus on that today, but just letting you know that that's another aspect that's in there. Instead, I'm going to talk about how individual level traits might influence the costs and benefits at the individual level of social behavior. So with that, all right. So as I mentioned, we have differences across individuals in certain traits. So we can think about that as like phenotypic variation. So phenotypic variation, thinking about that as just simply variation in across individuals in some type of trait, and that can be anything. Here we just have fish, we have gray fish and we have orange fish. And so here, we've got a little shoal of fish that are mostly gray, and we have one fish that is orange. And so we have this other shoal where all the fish are orange. So we can see that, wow, if this fish is orange and hanging out with all of these gray fish, it's going to stand out and might be more conspicuous to predators and more likely to get eaten. When that fish is with all these other orange fish, it is less conspicuous and perhaps less likely to get eaten by predators. And so we can think about this as there being benefits to these fish assorting by coloration, which means that they preferentially hang out with or socialize with individuals that have similar traits to themselves. We can also see negative assortment, which means that they preferentially socialize or associate with individuals that have differing traits than themselves. So I'll get into that a little bit later, but you can see from this very simple example how those differences in traits or similarities in traits might influence the patterning of social associations, just based on those costs and benefits of that social patterning. We also can have, and there's a lot of different work on this, and this is just an example, not necessarily related to the traits I'm going to be looking at, but differences across individuals in other traits that are also associated with just kind of the degree of other social traits. And so there's, here's an example of just some work that was done with exploratory behavior. So individuals that were more exploratory, more aggressive were found to have more but weaker associations with other individuals, and individuals that were less exploratory had fewer but stronger associations with individuals. And so, drawing from this previous work, I got to thinking, there are a couple really cool specialized traits in the system that I work with that actually, that might influence social behavior in the birds I work with. And so I got to thinking that I'm pretty interested in sociality. I should look into this. And I'm going to explain what these diagrams, how to kind of interpret them or what they mean in a little bit here. So let's just dive right into the study system I work in. So I work with mountain chickadees in the Sierras. As I mentioned before in the intro, this is at Sage Hen Experimental Forest near Truckee, California. It's absolutely gorgeous, and we are lucky that we go out there, do our field work. Sometimes it's a rough day. We bring our granola bars out there, and then we go home to our nice toasty houses. However, our mountain chickadees have what we call resident birds. They do not migrate. They have barely anything to eat during the winter. And they need to figure out a way to survive the winter when there's barely anything to eat. They are very small, and they have a very high metabolism because they are responsible for creating much like us, they're responsible for creating their own body heat. And so they can starve to death very easily. So they need to be consuming enough food to maintain that body heat to survive basically survive day to day. And so to cope with, all of these energetic demands and be able to have enough food to survive the winter, they do something pretty neat, and that is they cache food. And so food caching is something that you've probably heard about and probably are familiar with. There's a lot of different examples throughout various animal taxa, and that is basically they store seeds. Usually this chickadee here has a sunflower seed. We give them sunflower seeds. Those aren't naturally occurring where we study them. But usually they find the nuts that are in pine cones. And so they hide seeds all around in different spots. So they're not one of those food cachers that hide seeds, all of their seeds in a single place. They hide them all over the place. So these are like tens of hundreds of thousands of seeds that they have to place all over when those seeds are abundant during the late summer and early fall, when food is abundant, and then they have to retrieve those caches when food is scarce during the winter time in order to survive. So if they don't remember the locations of enough seeds during the winter time, they're not going to have food. They're going to starve to death. If they can remember the locations of all those seeds, then it's basically like having a full pantry in their, at their disposal. And so the type of memory that they use to recall those locations is a specialized type of memory called spatial memory or spatial cognition. And there's a special part of the brain responsible for this, but we're not going to get into today because we just don't have enough time. But these birds are highly specialized. They have particularly impressive spatial memory abilities. And so previous work in our lab has devoted a lot of time to testing this and researching these abilities. But it's also shown that they don't share the locations of these seed caches with each other. So they explicitly go to a decent amount of work to make sure that they are being as inconspicuous as possible when they cache those seeds. They also will fake cache. They'll move their caches just to make sure that no one else is finding out where they're caching those seeds. And so you might be thinking, why is she telling us about these caches if they're not sharing that information with each other? What would this have to do with social behavior? Well, not all chickadees are created equally. There's variation in spatial memory ability, we found. And spatial memory might, sure, it has to do, it's a good proxy for being able to, it's necessary in being able to recover your caches, but it's also, it might be necessary and able to find and remember the locations of other food sources. So not just caches. And if you're a bird that has not so great spatial memory abilities, it might benefit you to preferentially associate with individuals that have better spatial memory abilities, because those individuals might remember where there's a nice patch of pine cones that still have seeds in them, or maybe a water source, because this is we live in an area that has a lot of drought. So you might expect that individuals that don't have such great spatial memory abilities, they might be more social. They might hang out with more individuals to try to get information from those birds. And they might preferentially hang out with birds that have better spatial memory. However, birds that have better spatial memory abilities might be overall less social because they don't want to divulge that information. They might not want to have that information taken from them, from other birds, or they might just want to associate with other individuals that have better spatial memory abilities, just so that, they can go off and do their own thing. Those birds will go off and do their own thing. And they're not going to increase competition around those sources. Because if you have a bunch of birds following you around all the time, all of a sudden, if you lead them to a nice patch of food, you're going to have a lot of competition around that resource, which would not be very ideal for you. So those are kind of my thoughts around this, why I thought to go and look into this. All right, so those are kind of my questions, are individual level social traits related to that spatial learning and memory, and then also are social associations distributed non-randomly based on individual spatial cognition. And that sounds really fancy, the whole the associations being distributed non-randomly. That just means, is there any type of special assortment based on individual cognition? So do those better spatial cognition birds, so to speak, preferentially hang out with those better spatial cognition birds? And I keep saying hang out with, and I realize that sounds very casual, but preferentially associate is what I mean to say. Okay, so to do this, we use these smart bird feeders to collect data, and that's visitation data. And so they're, seems very fancy, but it's a lot of hard work fine-tuning these things. So we have these plastic leg bands that we put on. They're kind of like little bracelets that we have on our birds. We have to trap them, and I can go into that in more detail in the Q&A if we have time. But we have this one long band that we put on each of our birds that has a little microchip in it. So if you have a cat or a dog that's microchipped, it's the same type of technology. It's what we call it a PIT tag. Passive integrated transponder is what that stands for. And so each bird has a little unique ID that's encoded in that PIT tag. And so when that bird lands on our smart feeders, that PIT tag is scanned, and so that ID is logged in a computer board inside of that bird feeder. So I know who landed on the feeder and what date that was on and what time and what feeder number it was. So I get this nice data file that looks like this, and I do a bunch of stuff with those data files. And so I spend a lot of time on the computer when I'm not in the field, which is what I've been doing lately. So here's a video of what that looks like when these birds land on the feeders. And we can set the feeders to do a lot of different things. And what I didn't mention before is that the doors are also motorized. So we can make them open and close, which is very important in a second that I'll get into. I've also included a video of what the guts look like in those computer boards and then the inside of the doors. But what's also important to note is that we can program the doors or the boards, those computer boards, so that they will only open for certain birds and not open for anyone else. So with that, I'm going to tell you about how we test and evaluate each bird's spatial learning and memory abilities. So we have 8 feeders set up on a frame like this. So it's a spatial arrangement. And each bird is assigned to get a food reward. So the door will only open at a single feeder on the array. And like each bird is assigned to a different feeder. So like this bird that I marked with a little star, for example, this bird, their feeder is this feeder. And so when this bird lands on any other feeder, the door won't open, they can't get food. And so it can land on whatever feeder the first time it visits, and the door will only open at the feeder door with the star on it. And so the next few visits that it makes, if the bird is able to learn, it should make fewer and fewer visits to the feeders that are not this feeder. So over time, it should just go right to this feeder and not visit any other feeders. And so that's usually what we see. They usually learn pretty quickly. And that's how we can measure. So by looking at how many feeders it makes, or how many visits it makes to non-rewarding feeders, so feeders that are not this feeder, we can measure how quickly they can learn and how good their spatial memory is. So kind of show you what that looks like. So, you know, this bird made 2 errors, and then this bird might follow that other bird until it finds that. And then every visit after that, you know, they should get better and better and not visit non-rewarding feeders. So that's just a quick overview of how we measure that. And then to get our social metrics, I use this fancy type of analysis. Sorry if I'm going a little fast. I realize I'm zipping through. So this is the complicated part, I think. But to get our social metrics, I do a fancy thing called social network analysis. And so this is another one of those diagrams like what I had before. And so our birds visit in flocks. And so repeated visits by the same kind of, groups of individuals over time can give me a lot of information about the strength of associations between individuals. And so I can look at, because it tells me what birds visit on what date and what time, I can look at over a longer period of time, I can build upon common occurrences between individuals. And so it's a lot of automated data. It's a lot of fancy algorithms that then spit out a big old matrix at me. And so using, again, building from what individuals are seen together time and time again, I can calculate like strength of associations and things like that between individual birds, which is super cool. We're in a really awesome age of technology, and I know that makes me sound kind of old when I say that, but it's true. So from those automated, the same feeder data that I use for our cognitive tests, I can use to build these social networks. So to explain what these diagrams mean, each circle, which we call this is what we call a network diagram, and I want to let you know that these, if you see these other places, a network diagram that looks just like this can mean something completely different. It depends on the data that are collected, the researcher's question. You can manipulate these things to mean and display a lot of different types of data. But in my examples here, each of these circles is going to represent a different bird, and I'm going to tell you, what the edges mean. So I'll tell you what an edge is in a second. So each circle is an individual bird. We call these nodes. And then the lines that are connecting different nodes, that is what we call an edge. And that is a social association between two birds. The thickness and darkness of the edges I have weighted to mean the strength of the social association between two individual birds. So that means that thicker and darker lines mean a stronger social association between two birds. I'm not going to get into the size and color of the nodes because it's just not applicable to what I'm going to show you here. But you can make those display a lot of different types of data. And we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to show you one where I colored the nodes differently in a little while. Okay, so let's talk about, I'm going to go over a couple different metrics just to show you kind of some of the things that we can measure or some of the things that I looked at to kind of answer some of my questions. So one thing that we can look at when we're asking questions about some social behavior is just kind of how many social associations does each individual bird have. So that might tell me if one bird is more social than the other, we might expect that it has more social associations or social associates than the other. And we call this measure degree. So bird A has 1, 2, 3, 4 social associations, whereas bird B has 2 social associations. So bird A has a higher degree than bird B. Pretty straightforward. But for me, I found that my birds are rather gregarious and they kind of all hang out with the same number of individuals as each other. So I like to take the strength of those associations into account. And so there is a metric that does almost the exact same thing as this, except for it takes into the weights of those edges. And we call that very appropriately, very creatively, weighted degree. And so this simply just takes into account the edge weights, and depending on how scientists are researching their animals, these values will can vary a lot more and will have different values, but mine only vary from 0 to 1. 1 meaning that individuals are seen almost all the time, like at any time that they're observed observed together. 0 meaning that they're never observed together when they're observed, if that makes sense. So these birds are almost always seen together. So whenever this bird's observed, it's almost always observed with this bird, is what that means. But yeah, so this is more informative for me in my system. At least that's what I've noticed. But you might also notice here that this bird has one really, really strong association, and then kind of a mid-range association, and then a couple really weak associations. And you might be thinking, well, there's a lot of variation here, but a bird like this bird has kind of, well, slightly more evenly distributed associations. And I've noticed that as well. And so I like to look at the variation across social associations, because there might be birds that just have a couple really strong associations. And we call that social differentiation. It kind of gives us an idea of how choosy or picky certain birds are. And that could be really helpful, especially if we're talking about if there's levels of assortment in our networks. So here's an example. We can have this bird that we just looked at, and we have, again, our degree of 5, our weighted degree of 1.9, but we can calculate the coefficient of variation across all of these associations, and it's very high. So it's very socially differentiated. But if we consider bird B, it has the exact same weighted degree, exact same degree, but it has a much lower coefficient of variation, so less social differentiation. So those are just some things that I look at. And remember, we can look at the association, look for associations between that and then our phenotypic traits, which are, that spatial memory abilities and things like that, to look for associations. Just want to quick go over assortment and what that would look like if we were talking about our networks. So if we had positive assortment, this is not what it would look like necessarily for cognition, but if we had just orange birds and blue birds, we'd expect, if we had positive assortment, that individuals that are similar have the strongest edges, so the strongest associations between them. So we'd have strong edges between orange birds and strong edges between blue birds. And then if we had negative assortment, we'd have the strongest edges between individuals that are more dissimilar and weaker edges between individuals that are more similar. So just a reminder of what our questions are, because I talked about how I study all this stuff for a very long time. So my questions again are individual level social traits, so all the metrics I just talked about related to spatial cognition. So that spatial learning and memory test I talked about, where we assign birds to feeders, and then are social associations distributed non-randomly based on individual spatial cognition. So is there any type of negative or positive assortment based on those social traits? Those are the two basic questions I'm asking. And so I just wanted to quick do a little summary of my preliminary findings, not totally solid results just yet. So first off, as I found before, pretty much all the birds are associating with all the other birds that are present at the feeders. So I didn't find any relationship with degree, which is just the number of associates or associations at all. But I did find a positive relationship with cognitive abilities and weighted degree. And so that means that cumulatively, birds with better spatial cognitive abilities, so better spatial learning and memory, had cumulatively stronger social associations and somewhat lower social differentiation. And I also found slightly negative assortment, which means that there was, and kind of just talked about this, but birds that had kind of dissimilar, that were at either end of the spectrum or less similar in terms of their spatial cognitive abilities, had those stronger associations, whereas birds with more similar spatial cognitive abilities did not so much in terms of the strength of their social associations. And I just wanted to quick show you what that looked like with a network diagram. And so this is kind of what that looks like. So here I've kind of weeded out some individuals for clarity, and I've colored the nodes to show you individuals and their spatial learning and memory abilities. So in birds that have better spatial learning and memory abilities have darker blue colors, and birds with worse spatial learning and memory abilities are lighter blue in color. And so, like I said, we have slight trends in slight negative assortment. And so if we look at this bird, which is pretty, mid-range, pretty good in terms of their learning and memory ability, the strongest associations are with those lighter colored nodes, so individuals with worse learning and memory abilities. And then if we look at this bird, which is not so great in terms of learning and memory abilities, lot of those stronger associations are with individuals that are much better than it with those learning and memory abilities. And of course, it's not perfect. There are some of those stronger relationships or associations rather with birds that are similar to itself. And it's not cut and dry. So these aren't super straightforward analyses. But I just want to say my conclusion, or what I think, I'm going to speculate wildly here, what I think might be going on so that I can give you a general conclusion. I think what might be happening, because we have that higher weighted degree, low social differentiation, and the negative assortment with the birds based on their cognitive abilities, is I think that individuals with worse spatial memory might be preferentially associating with the birds with better spatial memory, but it might not necessarily go the other way. So the birds with better spatial memory might just be kind of like going with the flow, not as choosy, not really caring. The birds with worse spatial memory are associating with everyone, especially the birds with better spatial memory. However, that's speculation. I have no idea for sure, because that's outside of the scope of this experiment. So future directions, I need to figure that out. So that's kind of the next steps for me. And with that, that's kind of everything for today. And I just want to thank all the awesome scientists I've gotten to work with in the past and I'm currently working with, and all the funding sources, the staff that works out at Say-10 Creek Field Station, and Berkeley, who runs that field station. And I would like to open that up to any questions that we might have. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Angela. That was great.
Oh.
So we're going to open it up to audience questions, and I have a couple to kick us off here. So first off, I just wanted to know how many birds were a part of the experiment?
Oh man, for this particular year, like, I didn't even look at sample sizes again. Usually we have anywhere from, I'm not remembering my exact numbers for this particular year. The data that I just showed, part of the reason I'm saying it's preliminary is, number one, I haven't looked again at the data, but we want to actually expand it over, I want to say, a 5-year period, which will include, I want to say, like a couple of hundred birds, but some of those birds are individuals that have participated over multiple years. We've banded, so when I say banded, I mean birds that we've put those leg bands on. I mean, we've banded over 1,000 birds, but you know, between we have multiple elevation sites as well. So we have 2 different elevation sites. So that's across those 2 and over, you know, we started banding back in 2014. And so it's like, you know, I think our best year, which is this year, we've tested, I think my advisor just gave me the number, and it was like 200 birds. But I think on a good year, we get to test like, I think like 60 is good for low elevation. And that's probably like our best that we've done. And then, you know, like 100 at high. And that might be on the lower end of my estimates. But I want to say that the paper I just submitted, we did about, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on numbers.
That's
we did about, I want to say it was about 160 total. Yeah, and so this one's a little bit more, but I know that we want to expand this study to include more years. So, so it's going to be higher than that, and that was in a different year too. So I know we had more birds that year as well. So probably closer to 200.
So, and then I wanted to clarify that if you were to change the sample size to be bigger or a little bit smaller, does it still represent the same average that you would expect to see across all the different studies?
Same average for what?
So would you get the same average results if you were to change the sample size?
So I'm not, so there's a couple different things that I think could change results. And I don't necessarily think the sample size itself matters. I think demographics would really change things. And that's because we know that spatial cognition is related to survival. So birds that don't have such great cognitive abilities are the ones that are more likely to die. They don't survive the winter. And a lot of times those individuals are juveniles, because variation that exists, the variation often exists in the birds that hatch that year, and they often don't survive their first winter. And that seems to not necessarily apply to both of our elevations. We're getting very complicated all of a sudden. I'm like, read all of our papers, and then you'll get like the full. I'm like, this is why the whole scope of when I said that I'm not going to necessarily touch on all of the environmental aspects. I'm like, this is why our system gets very complicated, because we talk about the environmental aspects quite a bit, or like the physical environment, and that complicates things a lot, because we do see a lot of elevational differences, because the milder environment has, it appears that there are much more relaxed selection pressures because it's a milder winter. So if there are more resources, much more mild winter, you might not starve to death. Whereas if you were in a harsher environment and you don't have such great cognitive abilities, you can't find those caches, you wouldn't have survived. So it's one of those things where if you have relaxed pressures in that milder environment, you might be able to kind of scoot by. And so it's one of those things where it seems like there are different things that are happening at our high elevation site versus our low elevation site. And the reason that I'm saying that is that because I think that demographics matter differently at our two different sites, because juvenile birds are more likely the ones that are going to have worse spatial memory abilities, because when we have variation in those memory or those cognitive abilities, where we have a lot of the worse, not so great birds, at high elevation, those individuals are less likely to survive the winter. Lower elevation, they might get by, if that makes sense. And a lot of times those are your juvenile birds. So if those are included in our networks, all of a sudden, if we have more individual birds or more juvenile birds included in that network, I expect their behavior to be different in terms of assortment and things like that. I think that they'd more likely be the ones driving certain patterns of assortment and things like that, because they might be trying to get information differently, but it might not. I mean, they might be doing different things in terms, because they're more desperate or something like that, depending on where they're living. So that was a really long-winded answer, because it's very complicated, and it depends, I think, on where they're living, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It sounds like the average results would be expected to be the same if you had the same general population of birds, but if the environment or the population, depending on age range or weather factors, were to change in those constraints, that the results might be totally different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, if it was all adult birds at our high elevation site, I mean, I don't, and so that's the thing is, I'm like, but all of a sudden, if we're throwing a bunch of juveniles in there, that's where it would potentially change. And so I think that's because it would add more variation. So, and yeah, so it might not necessarily change results, but I think it would inadvertently just add more variation in cognitive ability. So, might maybe not even necessarily change the results, but just strengthen the direction of a signal,
Sure.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the feeding system that you were talking about. I thought it was really fascinating, and I wondered, is that something that's new? When was it developed, and did you tailor it to this experiment?
So that is something that my advisor, and I want to say, I'm like, oh, I don't want to credit this to a specific lab member, because that was developed like the year or a year before, like a year or 2 years before I started grad school. So that was like 2013, 14, I want to say. But that is something that is attributed to our lab's work. And then we have an awesome collaborator, Eli Bridge, who is in my acknowledgement slide, that has been so patient and awesome, like on email all the time, and like working through sabbaticals, that he's taken, that is on the computer board side of working with us on that kind of thing. But it was kind of the development of these computer boards, and then the different applications of those things. And then I want to say that it was, like one of my previous lab mates that was like, hey, we could use, this is all before I started. I'm like, this is through the grapevine of, like being like,
Sure.
well, actually, I was the one who said this. And it's like, okay, well, but either way, this was something that our lab implemented for testing these kinds of things. Now, to be said, or with that said, there are other labs that have used automated technologies like pressing buttons and sliding doors and things like that. But the nice thing that we really like is that this is not problem solving, because in the wild, our birds don't need to solve problems to do what they naturally do, which is just caching these seeds. It's something that they normally do. And so we wanted something that would mimic the natural act of recovering seeds or using that spatial memory the way that they normally would. And so we didn't really, doing a problem solving experiment doesn't make sense in terms of, how they're using their spatial memory abilities in a more wild setting. It's like they don't have to solve anything, they just simply have to land on the feeder. And we do so that's why we didn't use any of the things that other people had been doing. And so simply this is just, they land on a feeder and it's like, the door doesn't open. Okay, well then land on a different feeder. And so once they figure out, okay, this is the one that opens, then it's like the next time they stop at that whole, almost, we call it an array. And so once they stop at the array again, it's like, okay, so that's when they have to use that spatial memory to figure out which one of those 8 is the one that will give them a reward. So it's not solving anything, which was very important in the experimental setup. And so that's kind of what sets it apart and why it's like, our lab was the one. And so it's like, credit goes to my advisor and the people that were here before me. So in coming up with that. And so I know that other labs now have started that work with different species of chickadees. And I'm not sure if there were other species of closely related birds that have started, that also food cache. I think they've started using those, a similar setup to try to address similar questions. But hopefully, I'm excited to see what they find, because I think there's some cool work being done, to get kind of adjacent questions with a nice twist on it that I'm just, interested in seeing what they find. So, but
yeah, it's great to see scientists sharing information, developing the system here at UNR, and then sharing it with other scientists doing related research. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to wrap up here, but I want to thank you so much, Angela, for sharing your research. I do also want to mention that in our summer or our fall research program this year, we had a student complete her bird research as well, and that's published in the Student Research Journal, which you can find on our website. And her name's Laura. She'll be giving a talk coming up this month, and that's also listed on our blog. So if you want more about birds, you can find that on our website. If you want more from the fabulous Angela, you can always type in questions to the video here, and we'll make sure that we send them to her and get them answered for you. Thank you very much, Angela.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.